Thank you very much, Professor DeVoe, for that introduction. Thank you all of those who are involved with bringing me here. It's a great pleasure to be here on your beautiful campus and have a chance to talk to you about this topic. Now, why the ethics of what we eat? We haven't typically thought of food as an ethical issue, although it's certainly something that we've always done. So, start off with this little cartoon about our existence, tracing back a few million years. We've always eaten, and we've always survived and reproduced, and that's how we've got where we are. But it's only relatively recently, you could say, that we've stood up and started to philosophize about what we eat, why we eat, what should we eat. And in fact, the idea that this is a central ethical question is still something that people typically do not accept. We think of a range of ethical issues. We've been looking at ethical issues, for example, in the presidential campaign. People have been trying to find things that people have done that may be unethical. They may involve financial corruption, taking money from people to influence your vote. We're familiar with that kind of lack of ethics. We're familiar with charges of lying, which is unethical. We're familiar with the idea that your sexual behavior is central to how ethical you are. But I haven't heard anyone, in trying to blacken anyone else's character in this campaign, say, well, but what is it that you eat, right? Isn't there a question there? Maybe there should be. Maybe by the time I'm through, you will think that that is indeed an issue that reflects on the ethics that people have. I certainly hope so. So, let me try and make that case. But first, what are the various possibilities? There are, of course, a wide range of things that we might choose to eat or not eat on various grounds, and I can't cover them all. I'm starting with a list roughly like this as the kinds of choices that we might make. So we could start off eating what is commonly called the standard American diet. The acronym might be significant. It's obviously it's a diet that's fairly heavy in animal products. It's also a diet that's mass-produced, and significantly, it's a diet that's inexpensive, which of course is a good thing. People have been trying through most of that evolutionary history just to get enough to eat, and there's no doubt that the American diet provides most Americans, virtually all Americans really, with enough to eat. So that's a good thing, but is there more to say? So then there are other options. There's the vegetarian option that's been around for quite a long time. People are familiar with that to a certain extent as to what you might avoid eating meat. We know people who have been vegetarians for centuries for a variety of reasons, religious, health reasons, and also relating to animals. The next category, the vegan diet, is something that probably 10 years ago most people would have said, what's that? What does that term mean? And it's really interesting, I think, the way that term has at least been more widely understood over the last decade, largely due to the fact that the animal movement has been promoting it to a large extent. Also, some people are promoting it on health grounds as well. But so I think people now understand that a vegan is a person who doesn't eat any animal products and that it is possible to live that way. Of course, whether you should eat that way is another question entirely. And then we've had a large boom also in organic food production. So this has been the fastest growing section of agricultural production in the United States over the last few years, and there's clearly a question as to whether that's what we should be doing. Is that the direction we should be going in, making those choices? Also, quite recently, we've had a focus on the idea of eating locally. There's even a term for it now, the locavore, person who just eats stuff that comes within a certain distance, and the defining distance varies a little. Is it 100 miles? Is it 500 miles? People set different standards, but eating from your local area rather than more widely, is that a good thing to do? Why do people want to do that? Should they do that? And then, not very well known in this country as applied to food in general, but known for coffee and tea at least, is the fair trade movement. The idea that we should be eating products that are fairly traded, whatever that term might mean, and it has a specific definition. And in Europe, for example, there is a wide range of foods that have the fair trade label, much more widely available than in this country, although there's been some growth in it here as well. So I want to briefly look at all of those things, but I also want to make sure that I leave enough time for some questions and discussion at the end, so I might have to go fairly quickly over some things. But if I pass something that you think is important, well, just remember it and get in early at question time and you'll be able to raise it. Okay, so these are the issues that I want to focus on particularly. The animal issue, as Professor DeVos said, is something that I've written about for many years, looking at issues about how we ought to treat animals. I think that's important, and I'm going to start with that. The environmental question is something that we've paid more attention to recently, and we have been hearing about the global food crisis over the last few months in particular, and that's also something that we ought to look at. So, animals. The first important start, and I think it is obvious to most of us, but needs to be said, is that at least some non-human animals are conscious beings. By that I mean they have experiences. They are subjects of experiences. And in particular, of course, they can feel pain, they can suffer in other ways, or they can enjoy their lives. And if you want to know, say, well, how do we know that? This very briefly are the three major reasons. You can look at their nervous system, their anatomy, what physiologically changes in situations where they might be feeling pain. We can watch the way they behave. And we know that we come out of the same evolutionary past. It would be strange if we have evolved with a similar nervous system and a similar anatomy and similar behavior, and it doesn't work in the same way, that it somehow works in a completely different way. So when we put our hands into a fire, we pull them out because we feel pain. We watch an animal put its paw into a fire and it pulls it out quickly, and we know the same things go on in its nervous system, but somehow it's completely different. It's not feeling pain. That's not impossible, but it would be something that would need to be explained. So I'm going to take it as assumed, unless someone wishes to challenge me in question time, that there is pain in animals. They can feel pain and they are conscious beings. Now, that's not of all animals. I think it's fair to say that in this list, the case for saying that there is a capacity to feel pain and there is consciousness is in descending order of strength. So I would say that case is overwhelmingly strong for mammals and birds. In fact, I would say it's extremely strong also for vertebrates. When you get to invertebrates, you might want to be a bit more selective. You might want to say, well, some of them show behavior that makes it seem that they're conscious, but couldn't necessarily say that about all of them. Crustacea, for example, they have a quite different nervous system from us. Not a single, not centrally organized in a single brain in the way that ours is. Can we be sure that they feel pain? Well, maybe, not sure in the sense that we can be sure that birds and mammals feel pain. But perhaps we can still think it's quite probable that they feel pain. But if you get down to clams and oysters, the nervous system is so rudimentary and there isn't really the kind of behavior that you can see associated with pain in the other animals. Maybe you want to say no. Maybe you can say, look, I can't say it's impossible, I can't exclude it for sure, but seems unlikely that clams and oysters are capable of feeling pain. I don't know, a certain amount of agnosticism, but mostly what I'll be talking about anyway is about vertebrates. So I think the case is strong. Now, what is the ethics of how we ought to treat animals? What I've put up here is some traditional views looking at some of the great philosophers of the past and what they have said about how we ought to treat animals. And if you read these, you'll see that they are not very sympathetic to taking animal interests seriously. we get Aristotle saying that the whole of nature is a sort of a hierarchy in which the lower forms of life exist for the sake of the higher forms, and so the plants exist for animals and the brute beasts exist for the sake of man. What I left out here is that the barbarians exist for the sake of the more rational civilized beings, which Aristotle used to justify slavery. But it's all a hierarchy, and this is just part of the same hierarchy. For Aquinas, he takes, although he also follows Aristotle to some extent, here in this quote, he takes the idea of God's dominion as recorded in Genesis, he takes as meaning essentially that we can do what we like with the animals. It's obviously an interpretation and not the only possible interpretation of that line in Genesis, but that's how Aquinas uses it, and that has had an enormous amount of influence in Christian thinking since Aquinas. And then we get to Immanuel Kant, still regarded as one of the great philosophers, one of the great ethicists, saying that, well, it's self-consciousness that's really important, and everything else, animals, are just merely a means to an end, that end being us. So animals not being self-conscious, we have no direct duties to them. And the only reason that Kant gives for against cruelty to animals is that if you're cruel to animals, you might develop a disposition that would make you cruel to human beings as well. The animals themselves are not ends. It's only if it would have these sort of spillover bad effects on human beings that it would be wrong. And Aquinas also actually says something similar. Not all Kantians, I should say, take this view. One of the leading modern Kantian philosophers, Professor Christine Korsgaard at Harvard, thinks that Kant has made a mistake here. Although she generally is a Kantian, she thinks that this particular argument is just wrong. You don't need self-consciousness to be an end. You just need consciousness. So that's the background, and I mention that because these are thinkers that have formed the Western tradition. So if we feel some resistance to some of the things that I want to go on and say, maybe it's because these ideas still have a pull over us, that we haven't really freed ourselves from ideas of the past. But they're not the mainstream view today. This is much more like the mainstream view, that we do have some duties to animals. It's not that we have no duties to them. We have duties to be kind to them and to avoid being cruel to them. And we condemn cruelty in various forms. And this means that their interests count, but they're also easily overridden. And they're overridden by our own interests in various ways. For example, and this is the most important example that I'll focus on, for example, in producing that inexpensive food that I mentioned at the beginning, cheaply producing meat or eggs. Well, here's one question. If we take that mainstream view, is modern farming compatible with it? The way we actually treat animals. So is there, even without going into a different philosophical approach to animals, is there a problem with the way we treat animals? A lot of people wouldn't really know how to answer that question because they don't actually know very much about how we treat animals today. And here's a quote not from anyone working for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals or any radical animal rights group, but someone who's a professor of animal science at Oregon State University, who basically spends his living teaching people who are interested in animal agriculture and in some way or other likely to have careers either raising animals or working in some way with animals that are being used in agriculture. And yet Professor Cheek says that most people don't really know how animals are treated, and if they did, then, as he says, some, perhaps many of them, would swear off eating chicken and perhaps all meat. So there is a question about the ethics of our food system already raised there, even before we go into details. Is there something wrong with a society which doesn't really know how its most common foods are produced. Shouldn't we at least know that? Don't we have a responsibility to be aware of how our food is produced so that we can decide whether or not there is an ethical question that's raised about it? And Professor Cheek agrees with that. He thinks that transparency is an ethical indicator and is troubled by the lack of it in the industry and in the United States today. And that's not an accident. I mean, it is actually quite difficult to get inside these places. It's particularly difficult to get inside with TV cameras if you do it in an open, legitimate way. I've had television programs saying that they would like to interview me on some topic about animals, and they said, look, we'd actually think it'd be interesting if we interviewed you with an animal. And I said, well, you know, look, that's fine, but I don't want to just be there with a dog or a cat sitting on my lap, because, you know, those are not really the issues that I'm most concerned about. They are not the worst treated animals in the United States today. If you want to do an interview with me, let's go inside, let's say, an egg-producing unit where there are, you know, the typical one that is responsible for about 98% of the eggs produced, and I'll show you a photo of it in a moment, and let's do the interview there, or a pig farm or something like that. They say, sure, great idea, that's terrific. Just a moment, we'll line one up and then we'll call you back. Then they call back a few days later apologetically, look, we're really sorry, we're a bit surprised by this, but we can't find anyone who will let our cameras into their farm. Well, I'm not surprised because I've got used to this. They are deliberately secretive. And the footage that you get, if you get it, you can get it on the web from a lot of the animal groups, is taken by people going in illegally, trespassing, or getting employed undercover in these places and going in with hidden cameras. So the industry has actually made it its business not to be transparent. But here is what the chicken is like that Peter Cheek was talking about. This is a standard chicken producing shed. As you see, it's a vast long shed. It has probably typically 20 to 25,000 chickens in it. They're pretty crowded. They have no hope of sort of getting to know a group of chickens, which is sort of normal for chickens growing up. They normally have a flock size, 30, 40, maybe up to 60 or 80, and they can learn to identify that many individuals and kind of know their place in the group, but obviously not with these sort of numbers. And also with these sort of numbers, there's clearly no individual attention to birds at all. There can't be. It just wouldn't pay economically, given how cheap they are. So all sorts of things go wrong in these systems. These are very fast-growing birds. The typical chicken that's produced in this and then sold at the supermarket is 42 days old when killed. So it's really a baby. But it's a very big baby because we've selected these birds over many, many generations to grow very, very fast. And that's the economics of it. That's the cheapest way to produce them. But one of the results is that their bones are still immature. And they grow to this weight that whatever it is when you buy them, 4 to 5 pounds, and their legs often can't actually hold them, and their legs may crumple under them, and they may just collapse onto the floor, unable to walk. Now, if that happens when they're far away from these, the lines are the feeding pipes that carry food and water. If that happens when they're far away from the feed and they can't get water, they're just going to die of thirst. And nobody is going to come through and say, oh, there's a sick bird, I better do something about that. Not even, I better pick it up and wring its neck. Generally speaking, they'll go through and pick up the corpses every now and again, because otherwise they decay and they get maggoty and so on. But, mostly they are there until they're dead. There's another shot of the same sort of thing, more from the bird's eye level. And the same sort of thing happens to turkeys. We're not that far from Thanksgiving, so you might like to think about what sort of turkey you're getting. This is, again, the vast majority of turkeys are produced in the same indoor sheds as the chickens are. There's one interesting difference. We've bred turkeys to have such large breasts that they are now physically unable to mate, the typical turkey that is sold in supermarkets. So every turkey that not every turkey, because there are a few places that have heritage breeds that they run around and they can still mate, but let's say 99% of the turkeys that Americans eat at Thanksgiving are the result of artificial insemination, which means that there are people whose job it is throughout the week to masturbate male turkeys and collect the semen, and there are generally other people whose job it is to take the females, put them in an uncomfortable position where it's possible to inject the semen into them, and do that all day with thousands of birds, where the more birds they get through, obviously, in a day, the more economical it is, but that's not showing any consideration for the birds. So there's a topic to bring up next Thanksgiving dinner. Okay, let's move on to pigs. This is a typical sow stall. This is a pregnant sow. She's the mother of the pigs who are sold for the prime pork or ham or bacon at market. She's basically a breeding machine. She's only profitable as long as she's pregnant, and very briefly when she's feeding her piglets. And she's easiest to manage, and she wastes less food, and she, so on, if she's individually confined like this. So she's basically like this for most of her life, really, or throughout the pregnancies. She's not got room to walk around. She's on bare concrete, because if you provided her with straw, she'd be more comfortable, but you would have to replace the straw every now and again. It would get filthy. That takes labour and costs money. You don't need to do it. She'll still survive like this, and you can just hose down the concrete. These are veal calves. More people, I guess, have heard of the intensive veal raising, and there has been something of a move to boycott veal as a result. They're also individually stalled, unable to walk around, because that produces the pale, tender flesh, again, most easily and cheaply in those conditions. So they're like this from basically the day or the day after they're born, when they're taken from their mothers, until they're taken to slaughter at about 14 weeks of age. This is a bit out of order. Sorry, there's another shot of the sows in a different system. This time they have metal slats to lie on rather than concrete, but you can see more clearly here how crowded they are, how they can't even get their legs into their own stall. They stick out, as in this one, they stick out into their neighbour. And this is the farrowing crate, so-called, when the sow gives birth. She's also confined. Again, you could give her straw and she would make a kind of nest. Sows have an instinct to build a nest. They start doing that normally a couple of days before they give birth. But that would cost more. You would need more space for them. This is an alternative that holds the sow so that she can't roll over and crush her piglets. And again, you can see this time, rather than being a breeding machine, she's a milking machine for the piglets. She normally, would be sort of curling around and holding them to her in ways that mammals do with their children, but she's not able to do that on this system. And these are the children when they're grown a bit bigger. They do have a little more room to move around, but they're still extremely crowded, and it's a very stultifying, boring environment for a highly intelligent, inquisitive kind of animal. And I mentioned the egg producers. This is a fairly typical egg unit. Birds are in cages. They're stacked up on top of each other. They have very little room to move around. I think I have another one there that shows how crowded they are. The eggs are collected automatically. It's a labour-saving device as much as anything, because the eggs can all be collected automatically. They sort of roll. The cages have sloping floors. They roll down to the front and can be collected from the front there. So, what are we to say about this from an ethical perspective? Well, here's a simple argument that as I said, I think is pretty much within the mainstream viewpoint, the view that we shouldn't be cruel to animals. It seems that, you could take from the idea that we shouldn't be cruel to animals that it's wrong to cause pain to animals without a good enough reason. And yet, I think it's clear that they do suffer in these forms of production that I just showed you. And we can discuss that again in question time, but I think there's a lot of evidence. It's not just a sort of emotive response to the pictures you've seen, or even to being in those places. There is a lot of evidence that they're suffering. It's not necessary. I'll show you more about that before. We can certainly nourish ourselves in other ways. So what is it why are we doing it? Well, we enjoy the way meat tastes, I suppose, and this is the cheapest way to produce it. But I don't think enjoyment of the taste is a good enough reason to justify the amount of suffering that the animals endure. If enjoyment is a good enough reason to justify making animals suffering, then why were we so hard on Michael Vick, the quarterback who was convicted of dogfighting? After all, no doubt the fans who go to dogfights enjoy the dogfights. There might be lots of fans and only a few dogs who suffer. So why is that enjoyment in some way doesn't justify the suffering, but the enjoyment of the way meat tastes is supposed to justify the much longer and more drawn-out suffering of the animals involved? I think it's very difficult to defend this even within that mainstream view. So this seems to be the conclusion, that we ought to stop eating the products of modern meat production, of the systems that I've just shown you. You might say, yes, okay, let's suppose that we accept that. Where should we go from there? Well, one thing that we can do is to do something political. The election that we're going to have on November 4th actually has not just one but two historic components to it. Obviously one is whether we will elect an African American president, or for that matter a female vice president. But California is voting on a historic initiative that would eliminate three of the things that I've just shown you. The individual crates for veal calves, individual crates for pregnant sows, and the battery cage for hens. It does this by simply requiring that it would be illegal to confine animals in a way that keeps them from being able to stand, sit, lie down, turn around and extend their limbs. The New York Times recently endorsed